This wasn't just the turning of a season. This wasn't the ordinary passage of time. No. Something had awakened in Elmore Hollow. Something buried long ago beneath the soil, beneath the silence, beneath the lies. It had waited there, patient and undisturbed, listening as the years passed. And now, it had risen, not with fury, but with purpose, watching, choosing. And the first to sense its coming were those who remembered the stories too old to be written, and too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The fog rolled in before first light, not in slow curls, but in dense suffocating swathes that devoured every hedge, chimney, and cobblestone of Dunswell Hollow, casting the village in a gloom so heavy it felt unnatural, almost sentient, as if the mist itself was watching. Miss Cora Bellamy, a woman with bones older than most of the parish, but a mind sharp enough to slice through pretense, stood at her frost-kissed window, one hand hovering above her tea as she stared out at the street, where no shadows moved and no birds dared sing. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the quality of it, like a room just vacated by something unholy. Then she saw it. Isabel Hargrove, the schoolmaster's niece, barefoot and running full tilt down the cobbled lane, her nightgown soaked and her face frozen in a mask of silent horror, as though whatever had driven her into the dawn had stolen her voice along the way. At that same moment, a single toll of the chapel bell cracked the silence, not the rhythmic peal of worship, but one dreadful hollow clang that sent a shudder through the village's spine. Wordless and tight-lipped, neighbors emerged from doorways and gardens, drawn together like iron filings to a magnet of dread, and followed the growing murmur toward the east end of the village, where St. Olwen's Chapel stood hunched beneath the elms. Miss Bellamy joined the gathering, her every step through the dew-slick grass echoing with the heaviness of intuition. By the time she arrived at the iron gate, Reverend Pomeroy was already standing pale and shaken beside Constable Brigg, who, despite his usual bluster, looked like a man who had seen something that would unmake his sleep for nights to come. Then came the whispers. Harriet Dobb had found her while delivering salves to the vestry, a smear of blood across the font's stone base, the chapel door ajar, and little Mildred Poole, the missing station master's daughter, curled beneath the altar in a posture of eerie reverence, her hands folded as if in prayer, but her eyes wide open, glassy and unblinking, staring straight into the beams above. She had been missing 3 days, presumed a runaway, but now that seemed like a comfort compared to what had truly happened. And what chilled Cora to the bone wasn't just the death, it was the date, the 23rd of September, precisely 7 years to the morning since the Thornley twins had vanished during harvest preparations, their last known location marked only by 2 small handprints on the fogged window of the same chapel. Their bodies had never been found, their names rarely spoken, and now, here again, a child, alone, found at the altar on the same day the mist returned. But there was something else, something no one else noticed. Elias Kent, the former rail porter, now leaning quietly against the stone wall, his face chalk white, and his eyes not on the body, but on the bell tower above, lips moving as if reciting something long memorized. Cora watched him with the growing certainty that he knew more than he would ever say aloud, because he was there the night the Thornley boys disappeared. And back then, he had sworn to the vicar that no one would ever know what was buried beneath the chapel floor. As murmurs grew, and the doctor's motor car pulled in, Miss Bellamy stepped back into the shadows, heart racing not with fear, but grim readiness. This wasn't grief settling over Dunswell Hollow, it was reckoning. And this time, whatever had been locked away behind silence and ritual had found its way out. Something was returning, slow and sure, rising with the fog and the fall of leaves. And the village, whether it admitted it or not, had always known this season would come again. From her vantage point near the old greenhouse, where ivy clung like skeletal fingers to shattered panes, Miss Eliza Thornhill peered across the frost-bitten orchard, to where a loose knot of villagers had begun to gather in hushed disarray around the abandoned mill's west courtyard, a place long regarded with uneasy reverence since the day the Wheelwright family vanished without explanation over a decade ago. Word had spread swiftly through the narrow lanes of Bramblefoot Hollow. Martha Ellery, the quiet spinster who kept to herself in the yellow-doored cottage near the vicarage, had been found at dawn, lifeless and twisted at the base of the disused grain silo, her arms stretched unnaturally overhead as though reaching for salvation, or resisting something that had pulled her down. "Most dreadful business," murmured Dr. Havisham, his voice tight with discomfort as he stepped through the broken gate, his well-polished boots crunching over brittle frost and splintered grain. "She appears to have suffered a fall, though quite how she came to be up there." He trailed off, glancing toward the rusted ladder that clung precariously to the silo's flank, its rungs slick with moss and wear. Miss Thornhill, her heart heavy, and her instincts sharper than ever, recalled how only 2 days prior she had observed Martha at the grocer's, glancing over her shoulder with such anxious regularity, that it had struck her as deeply troubling. That she should meet such a violent solitary end, now seemed no accident of fate, but the grim fulfillment of some long-brewing fear. Mrs. Larch, whose arrival was as swift as her gossip was persistent, whispered with pale lips, but she never went near the mill. She feared it always said the place had voices. Constable Ridley, already pale beneath his cap, approached the crowd with a forced authority, declaring, "Please, none of you must approach the silo. Inspector Fenwick is en route from Greystone, and has requested the area remain undisturbed." But Eliza, never one to be distracted by formalities, had already noticed several things that tugged at her practiced intuition. Muddy boot prints circling the base of the silo, far too large for Martha's diminutive frame, and a peculiar smear of what looked like crimson oil along one of the ladder's lower rungs. Most unsettling of all was the strange discoloration beneath Martha's fingernails, a yellowish stain that reminded Eliza of sulfur, a detail dismissed too quickly by Dr. Havisham, who seemed all too eager to rule it a tragic accident. Inspector Fenwick's arrival added an air of stern finality to the proceedings. A gruff, impatient man, he surveyed the scene with an air of practiced detachment, then pronounced, "An unfortunate fall, no doubt. Old structure like this, nothing strange about its failure." But Miss Thornhill, standing very still near the frost-covered brambles, felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. The mill, dormant for years, bore no signs of recent collapse. The ladder, though rusted, had not broken, and Martha Ellery, timid, methodical Martha, would never have climbed that silo in daylight, let alone at night without a reason. And now there were rumors, quiet but insistent, that strange lights had been seen near the mill at twilight for 3 nights running. A low hum, too, like a chant, heard by children who passed by on their way from school. The villagers, heavy with unease, began to trickle back to their homes, muttering prayers, and half-forgotten tales of what the wheelwrights had once disturbed beneath the mill's foundation. But Eliza remained, her gaze fixed on the old weather vane that now spun furiously despite the still air. Something had awakened in Brambleford Hollow, something buried deep in silence and superstition, and now it had taken Martha. As the sun slipped behind the orchard trees, casting the yard in long spidery shadows, Eliza Thornhill knew with grim certainty this was no accident, and whatever had started had only just begun. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hedgerows of Eldergate, the tragic tale of Clara Weston's untimely end had surged through the village of Briar like wind through dry leaves, swift, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Everywhere Miss Lillian Hargrove went, from the baker's quiet stoop to the pews of the ivy-covered parish church, murmured fragments of the event clung to conversations like burrs to wool. Clara, the reserved yet kind-hearted young woman who had worked at the old Thornbridge apothecary, had been discovered lifeless beside the ancient well behind her family's cottage, an unsettling location that evoked half-forgotten tales of whispered curses and inexplicable vanishings from a generation long past. Lillian had always believed that in small communities, reactions to tragedy often revealed far more about the living than the dead, and thus she found herself that morning at the village co-op, pretending to sort through gardening almanacs while listening to Mrs. Fenwick and Miss Crail discuss the unfolding mystery with breathless urgency. She'd been strange lately, Mrs. Fenwick confided in a half-hiss, always glancing over her shoulder, jumping at the postman's knock, and then those sealed envelopes. Identical handwriting, no return address. Miss Crail leaned in, her fingers tightening on the handle of her basket. And the strange herb she asked about, nightshade if you please. She claimed it was for an essay, but who writes essays in the middle of the night with candles burning and curtains drawn? Lillian, her features composed in polite neutrality, committed every word to memory as she continued her quiet route through the village, arriving next at the western cottage with a small bundle of lilies in her gloved hands. The door was answered by Clara's elder brother Julian, a man whose graying temples and meticulous attire spoke of lifelong restraint and unspoken burdens. He ushered her into a parlor that smelled faintly of lavender and old grief, its symmetry disrupted only by a teacup still resting on the windowsill. Clara's last, untouched. "We were planning a holiday," Julian murmured, his voice cracking with a pain too ordered to be fresh. She'd spoken of leaving the hollow, starting anew, and yet, he trailed off, his gaze falling to the floor, where a thread from the corner rug had been plucked loose as though by nervous fingers. Lillian's sharp eyes caught other things too. A drawer left slightly ajar, its contents too neatly disturbed. A faint sickly scent beneath the lavender that suggested tinctures not stocked by any reputable apothecary. Her heart beat faster, but her expression remained mild. As she left, Julian's hand lingered a moment too long on the doorknob, and his eyes flicked toward the well, where a crow now perched in solemn stillness. There was sorrow in Briar Hollow, yes, but sorrow alone did not explain the sleepless glances, the coded letters, or the scratches on Clara's wrist described by the constable as bramble-born. Though no brambles grew within 20 yards of the well, Lillian Hargrove, whose instincts had not failed her in 37 years of village living, walked home with a certainty growing like storm clouds behind her ribs. Clara's death was no accident, and what the village saw as still waters beneath morning's surface hid far darker currents indeed. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thinning September leaves, casting dappled patterns across the worn cobblestones of St. Hensley, a village that had until recently existed in an unremarkable stillness. But now something had shifted in the very air. The usual hush held a different weight, as if it carried a secret. A woman was dead, not just any woman, but Vera Langley, poised, private and unwaveringly composed, found lifeless in the shallow reed-lined pond behind her house. The villagers whispered their theories in restrained tones over their hedges and shop counters. She often walked there alone, some said. She'd been quiet lately, withdrawn. But none could explain why Vera had gone to that pond, or how she had ended up in it. It might have ended as an unfortunate tragedy, a woman perhaps overcome by melancholy. But then came the letters. No return address, no signature, just terse, anonymous notes written in a jagged, anxious hand. "If what you saw is revealed, everything will come undone." Found hidden in a jewelry box tucked deep inside a linen chest, far from where any visitor might chance upon them. From that moment onward, Vera's death transformed from an accident into a riddle. That was when Miss Eloan Hartley took notice. The retired schoolmistress, long regarded as little more than an aging relic by the younger villagers, still possessed a mind as sharp as frost, and a patience honed by decades of watching, listening, and remembering the things others forgot. She had seen death before. She knew the subtle tremors that preceded calamity, and she knew when someone was lying. Her first call was to Edwin Langley, Vera's father-in-law, the stiff and reticent master of the Langley farmhouse. Though he spoke in a low, mournful tone, something about him felt rehearsed. His home was spotless, perhaps unnaturally so, as if every surface had been scrubbed of something invisible. Miss Hartley noticed the shelf in the parlor, a gap among framed photos, where a picture had once stood. There were faint marks on the wallpaper behind it, a rectangular ghost of something deliberately removed. Vera had been distant, Edwin murmured, checking his watch again and again. Her nerves were never the same after that business with the calf dying last spring. But Miss Hartley saw the truth not in his words, but in what he tried not to say. His suit was too expensive for a man claiming financial strain. His shoes too new, and the look in his eyes, not sorrow, but calculation. More troubling still were the whispers she gathered from Millie, the village laundress, who remembered seeing Vera clutching a small leather-bound diary during her weekly visits. "One day she tore out a page right in front of me," Millie said, voice low. Her hands were shaking like whatever she wrote had scared her. That evening, Miss Hartley returned to the Langley house under the pretext of delivering condolences. While Edwin stepped away to fetch tea, she subtly examined the window ledge of Vera's room, a favorite hiding spot for many a young girl. There, wedged behind the heavy curtain rod, and nearly crumbling with damp, she found a scrap of torn paper, the ink smudged but still legible. If Edwin finds out, it's all over. The pieces were coming together, but the picture remained elusive. What had Vera known? What had she seen, or done, that led her to fear her own family? And then, just as the puzzle threatened to lose shape, fate dealt another card. The next morning, while Miss Hartley was trimming the brittle remains of her summer roses, she spotted young Lorna, barely 13 and usually all chatter, hurrying down the lane with a tight grip on a yellowed envelope. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes darting like a frightened bird's. It was clear she was trying to go unnoticed, but Miss Hartley's voice rang soft and firm across the hedge. "Lorna dear, is everything quite all right?" The girl froze. Her lip trembled, and in her trembling hand the envelope bore the same sharp slanted writing as the anonymous notes found in Vera's drawer. Something dark was unfolding beneath the village's prim exterior. The truth hadn't drowned with Vera Langley. No, the truth was alive, breathing, hiding in shadows. And Miss Hartley had seen too much of human nature not to know when death visits a village once it rarely comes alone. She froze instantly, her fingers curling protectively around the edge of a brown envelope as though contact alone could shield its contents from exposure. Clara's eyes, wide, glassy, snapped toward Miss Elira standing silently at the garden gate, her presence as quiet as a shadow but heavy with perception. Clara's face youthful and open like a page yet unmarked by life's darker inks, twisted into the unmistakable expression of someone caught not in wrongdoing necessarily, but in something hidden. "Oh, Miss Elira," she stammered, almost dropping the envelope, her voice brittle with unease. I wasn't, I just needed to." Her words fractured under their own weight. But Miss Elira, calm as ever, only tilted her head slightly and smiled. A gesture that was never merely kindness but a subtle invitation to disarm. "Come inside, dear," she said softly, her tone wrapped in a grandmother's care and an investigator's edge. "You look rather pale. I was just about to make some tea. Company makes it taste better, I always say." Within moments, Clara found herself nestled within the warm cocoon of Elira's sitting room, surrounded by the faint scent of lavender and worn books, her trembling hands wrapped around a delicate cup of tea whose warmth contrasted with the chill in her veins. The ticking clock on the mantel filled the silence between them until Elira, without looking up, spoke with that familiar nonchalance that often preceded revelation. "Lenora's death must have been quite the shock. You worked with her, didn't you? In the historical archives?" Clara nodded too quickly. "Yes, miss. Only part-time. During cataloguing surges, Lenora was always so precise about things." Elira's eyes flickered briefly with a knowing light. "I imagine she took pride in that archive." "Oh yes," Clara replied, her voice becoming steadier as she clutched routine like a rope. "She kept everything perfect, binders aligned. Climate control logged daily. Even the older manuscripts were aired just so. And she especially focused on the lower storage, the old archive basement beneath the west wing. She said it was ideal for the more sensitive materials." Elira nodded slowly, her fingers circling her own teacup. "And lately, anything out of the ordinary?" Clara hesitated, then bit her lip. She'd been down there more often, hours at a time. I'd leave and come back and her office would still be empty. She told me she was reorganizing. "But?" Elira prompted gently, sensing the weight behind Clara's pause. "It didn't make sense," Clara whispered. "That cellar is already immaculate. Every ledger, every shelf labeled in her own handwriting. But she wouldn't let me help, said she preferred to handle it alone. I thought maybe she was hiding something." The words seemed to echo in the room. Elira poured more tea, calm, steady, letting the rhythm soothe Clara's unraveling nerves. "Did she ever explain what required so much secrecy?" Clara shook her head, her voice dropping. "She got defensive if I even asked, and then I started noticing things. Her eyes flicked toward the door instinctively. Once I forgot my scarf and doubled back. I heard voices in the basement. Not Lenora's alone. There was a man. Low voices. Heated. Arguing. I didn't recognize the other voice, but it sounded urgent. Angry. Elira remained motionless, her thoughts folding inward. Clara continued, her voice barely audible now, as though saying it aloud would make it more dangerous. I asked Lenora about it the next day. She insisted I must have imagined it, said the pipes make strange noises in the winter. Her lips quivered. But miss, there were no pipes near that corridor. And then, there was the fire. Elira's eyes narrowed slightly. What fire? 2 nights before she died, I saw her in the rear courtyard, burning papers. Not old ones. New, fresh typewritten sheets, thick manila folders. Even some photos, I think. She kept looking over her shoulder like she was afraid someone was watching her. Clara's breathing quickened. After that night, she was different. Nervous. Kept double-checking the locks. I think someone wanted whatever she found. And she realized it too late. Elira didn't speak, but within her mind, old war-era memories stirred. Encrypted letters hidden in flour sacks, secret ledgers buried under chapel tiles. The fragile balance between truth and silence. It was always the same. Someone uncovers too much and begins to feel watched, followed, hunted. And now Clara sat across from her, young, frightened, holding the edges of a puzzle soaked in shadows. Whatever had started in that archives basement hadn't ended with Lenora's fall. It was still unfolding, still breathing in the silence, and Clara might already be its next chapter. It had been just after sunrise when Mrs. Halbray, a quiet widow known more for her roses than her opinions, spotted young Thomas Brigg emerging from the abandoned blacksmith's shed, his boots caked with damp soil, and his shirt torn at the hem, as though he'd crawled through something he shouldn't have. Miss Althea Cray, ever the early walker, and not above indulging in discreet curiosity, happened to witness the same boy later in the morning at the greengrocer's, hands shaking as he fumbled coins for a bundle of parsnips, his eyes darting like a creature aware of being watched. But it wasn't until the local schoolteacher, Mr. Linton, dropped by Miss Isadora Flint's cottage, with trembling fingers clutching a sealed envelope, one he claimed to have found pinned beneath the school's chalkboard, that the quiet churn of unease truly began to stir across Marrowdown. The note inside, written in an urgent but trembling hand, read only, "It's beneath the orchard stones. God forgive me." That evening, Miss Flint hosted a quiet gathering for the Ladies' Preservation Circle. Though the conversation was anything but preserved, whispers circled about strange movements near the orchard at twilight, a figure seen crouched low among the trees, and the faint sounds of metal grating stone. But when Mrs. Edwina Hartley suggested reporting it all to Constable Merrin, a silence fell over the parlor, heavy and awkward, until Miss Flint poured more tea, and changed the subject to chrysanthemums. The following morning, Miss Cray, drawn by that same itch of instinct that had served her well during the ration years, walked the long way round, finding herself conveniently positioned near the orchard wall just as Mr. Farrow, the church sexton, exited the rectory with what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger tucked under his coat, and a face pale as candle wax. She watched him cross the village green, without once looking up. Later she would swear, he paused outside the general store, seemed to whisper something into the shadows, then disappeared down Hollow Lane. But it was when Miss Flint's cat refused to enter the cellar, hissing and backing away with its tail bristling, that something deeper clicked into place in her mind. She remembered the delivery boy mentioning that the new crates of preserves were being kept above ground this year, just until the odor clears, though no one seemed able to explain what odor that was. And then there was the curious fact that the village solicitor, Mr. Quince, had taken 3 unannounced days away from his office, leaving no forwarding address and returning with a limp and a sudden reluctance to discuss property boundaries near the South Orchard. By the end of the week, what had once been scattered unease began weaving into something with form, whispers of old debts and older graves, of deeds misplaced and maps redrawn, and of a peculiar clause found in a will dating back to the